So I just filmed this entire video with no sound. Let's try this again, take 2. Hopefully it sounded a little better since I'm still getting out of that sickness. There may be a little bit more editing than normal because I'm editing out coughs or asides or whatever it is. But we're still gonna go on with the show. Let's talk about books. This week I wanted to talk about Joe Hill's new book, which is actually a collection of 4 novellas put together. It's called Strange Weather. It came out in the fall, right around the time when Stephen King's new book came out. So the King family have a lot of new things out. If you are interested in picking something up, those might be good choices. This one is definitely great if you haven't read Joe Hill before. If you're a fan of the channel, you know that I love Joe Hill and I'm actually a big fan of his. All of his books that I've read I have loved, and I actually like a little bit more than Stephen King's books in some ways. He definitely isn't as prolific as his dad, but he's also not been writing for nearly as long as his dad. But has a slightly different take to horror than his dad does, which I think aligns more with how I prefer to read a horror book. But that's up to you. If you're a big King fan, maybe you want to check out Joe Hill and tell me why you think Stephen King's horror is better. And I would argue, hey man, give him time. But he put out this collection of 4 novellas that are all really great stories, but aren't quite long enough to be their own books, right? They're shorter novels, so they're more pithy, they get straight to the point, and there's none of this long meandering story that you get with King. He does write longer stories that are more meandering in a way, but these are all sort of quick, fast, loose, just getting to the point and getting over it. I listen to these on audio rather than reading them normally, and I would recommend that because each of the stories has a different narrator. It's not like they chose one narrator to narrate one story and that one guy had to read the 3rd story, which is from the point of view of a woman. So that's really great. I really enjoyed the performances, but I think I'm a little bit biased when it comes to Joe Hill's writing, and I would have liked it even if it was maybe bad acting. I just would have then said, maybe pick up the book. I think either format is fine for this, but I did enjoy the audiobook, so there is that. I wanted to go through each of the stories and talk about what I liked and what I thought about them in a sort of snappy way. I'm trying not to have a super long video here because I find that I like my videos less when I get super rambly. I think the first story was actually my favorite, and there are reasons why I really loved some of the later stories, either their uniqueness or their pertinence to today's society, but the first story was definitely my favorite story out of all of them, just when it comes to like just enjoyment value. And it's maybe the most traditional horror story that is in this book. They are all in their own way a horror story and a different type of horror story, but this first one has to do with mental illness, and it starts with this young man who sees his old caretaker, babysitter, nanny, whatever you want to call it, wandering down the street. She's an old woman now, and he sort of picks her up and helps her get back to her house. And she keeps saying that she's looking out for this cameraman, this guy with the camera, and he uses the camera to take her memories. Now, as a reader, you're thinking, oh, she must have Alzheimer's or dementia or some other disease of the mind that is causing her to deteriorate and become confused and be unaware of what decade it is and talk about things in a way that you're not quite positive of, that she's aware where she is right now. But the great thing about Joe Hill's horror is that it walks, like his dad's, walks the line of supernatural versus natural phenomenon, whether it is a human issue, a morality issue going on, or, you know, whether the real can be surreal and the surreal can become real. And he's really good at that, and I think that he hits the nail on the head with this story. So yeah, the main story is following this young boy and questioning whether the cameraman is a real, like, real thing, or whether it's just coming to terms with, you know, the people you love aging and having issues, and what that looks like. It has a lot of the elements that I really loved in Joe Hill's books, where you're looking at whether doing the right thing is morally right or morally wrong, or whether the right thing can be morally wrong. It also has this questioning of roles in society when the caretaker needs to be taken care of, and also just a really sweet way to look at aging and the elderly, which you don't see a lot when you have a horror story based around characters with mental illnesses like Alzheimer's and dementia, usually they're the bad guy. And in this story, no, she needs to be protected. She is a weak character that this young boy who needed her growing up is now standing up to be her caretaker. And I think that story really did a great job with all of these elements, and for that reason I think it was my favorite. The second story was perhaps my least favorite out of all of them, not because it was poorly done. Don't get that idea. All of them are very well written and very well done. It just didn't gel well, particularly with me. I think it would be great for somebody who has a fear of heights, because a lot of the tension in the second story has to do with heights. A young man decided that he would jump out of an airplane with some of his friends because one of their friends died of cancer, and they had all decided to sort of do her bucket list for her. And when he jumps out of this plane after having a panic attack and not wanting to do it, he lands on a cloud and becomes trapped there alone. So the story is of feeling isolated and completely pulled out of reality, and a lot of that is paralleling this idea of, having somebody you cared about who's quite young die, and sort of the surrealism there. But also this weird landscape of being stuck on a cloud and starving to death because there's no food up there. Plus the cloud is a little bit sentient and doesn't want him to leave because it's lonely. So there's this, personification of this cloud, which may or may not be a cloud, it might be something else. And this external struggle of wanting to survive. And I think that external struggle is the thing that didn't quite grab me. There, of course, were some internal struggles that he's going through while being on this cloud, but most of the danger has to do with these external issues. You were trapped, you were starving, you could fall to your death. And I don't find that particularly scary in a novel because I'm not threatened, right? Like, it's not having me question my sanity or question anything along those lines. It's all in this character's head, and it's not as scary for me. That's just the truth of it. So if you have a fear of heights, it might be a little bit more scary for you, but it was still interesting, a very interesting idea. I've never sort of read anything along the lines of being trapped on a cloud. That's a very unique idea, I think. The third story is again a unique take on a more traditional horror story. We have the post-apocalypse. It takes place in Boulder, Colorado, where this young woman who has just married her fiance, a very sweet lesbian couple, who loses her partner and her partner's mom in one day, where most of the population of Boulder, Colorado are killed by the sky raining these shards of glass, these needles, which impale anybody who is outside. If you were not undercover inside, somehow protected from this rain, then you died. There's no way to survive it. It was just the sky became sharp and you were dead. Even through things like cars, any glass windows would have shattered and you would have also been injured that way. So lots of people died, and it follows this protagonist who's trying to get to her fiance's father, or her wife's father, who was in the city at the time, and she's hoping that he's alive, and traveling along this road right after this huge cataclysmic event. So it has some more traditional, like, whether people would become crazy and be cultists, or whether people would be a bit more willing to break the law, because obviously there was this huge cataclysmic event, and whether lawlessness takes place, even if it is only in the one city. There's a lot of questioning whether this was a natural phenomenon done by environmental issues, or whether it was an act of terrorism where somebody has caused this weird crystallized rain to happen, and if so, whom and why. A lot of these conversations were happening, and again, the struggles were not as external. There were some physical threats to her character, but a lot of the story is her internally wondering about all of these things and trying to pick up on clues, and I really enjoy that type of story, along with, again, the gray morality of are these people harmless? Are they going to attack you? Do you try to avoid them, or do you attack back? What is the correct way to navigate a post-apocalyptic landscape? So again, with enjoyment value, I really liked this one. I think it was my second favorite. The last story here is I don't want to degrade it by saying it's like my third favorite, right? It was towards the bottom. It was in the bottom half of the 4 stories, but I think actually is the most important for people to read, and the one that I feel like is going to stick around much longer as a narrative than the other stories are. Like, it's unfortunate because I enjoyed the other stories, but I don't think that that's a problem, because this one is much more pertinent to today's society. This is looking at a situation that could definitely happen tomorrow in a mall with a shooting. It's not necessarily a mass shooting in that, like, not hundreds of people are dying, but multiple people die, and it's this chain of events that happen because of miscommunication, struggles that in particular people with power face, and in particular men with power face. So a lot of the struggling has to do with this idea that we have of profiling. It has a lot to do with men in power abusing their power against women. It has a lot to do with the idea that men have that they need to be the hero, right? And that they can do no wrong, and that because they have power and wealth, that any choice they make is worthwhile. There's questions of adultery. There's questions of racism and prejudice against religions. There's questions of slight mental illness when it comes to gun control, especially in America. It's very set in today, looking at our issues today and why issues today lead to these sorts of events where people are killed and innocent people are killed because of cultural notions that we have. There's some questioning of toxic masculinity and some questioning of just the issues with power that come with being a man with power in today's society. I think you can see from me talking about it obliquely why this one I feel is going to stick around a little bit more and really should be talked about and discussed more, and because it is a novella, right? It's not this full-fledged thing that you need to pick up and spend hours reading and analyzing, but it's this short little thing that you spend a little bit of time, maybe an hour and a half, ingesting and then thinking about and hopefully using as you go forward. And I think it's important for people to read, especially people who have positions of power, like I'm not even talking like heads and CEOs of companies, but people like mall cops and people like local police officers might want to read this and use it as a bad example of what it means to be a hero, or attempting to be the hero, because there is a lot of issues in that. Yeah, so all 4 of these stories were really great, worth it, well worth the read, well worth the listen if you can get a copy of it. But again, I'm a little bit biased. I love Joe Hill. Have you read Joe Hill before? If not, I have other videos that you can go and see and debate whether Joe Hill's for you. Are you a King fan and have you just missed out on Joe Hill somehow? And you really should go pick him up. Just go pick him up. I love you guys, and I hope you're having good weeks. I will talk to you again soon.